It was the middle of the semester, and the buzz around campus was all about the upcoming talent show. Every student from every department had been preparing for months, fine-tuning their acts. Some were singing, some were dancing, and a few were doing stand-up comedy. Everyone had a talent they could show off, everyone except Elon Musk. "Can you believe he signed up for the talent show?" whispered Jessica, a psychology major, as she leaned toward her friend as they sat in the crowded student union. "I mean, he's got to be a joke, right? Elon Musk, the guy who everyone knew for his unconventional ideas, and strange dreams that seemed to float somewhere between genius and madness, was about to step into the most public spotlight of his college life. No one was sure what to expect, except that, based on his previous antics, it was likely to be bizarre. Jessica and her friends weren't the only ones who felt this way. Most students, especially those in the business school, had laughed when they heard the news. They thought he was odd. Who would take the time to sign up for a talent show if they were truly serious about their future? Elon Musk wasn't the kind of guy you'd expect to step onto a stage to entertain. He was the kind of guy who spent his days building computers and his nights thinking about creating a new form of energy that could save the planet. To many people, his dreams seemed too big, too outlandish. But here he was, and everyone was waiting to see what he'd do. What could Elon Musk possibly offer in a talent show? "Maybe he'll try to build a rocket on stage or something," another student joked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, right. Watch him try and make a toaster that flies." Laughter followed, and Elon felt the sting, but he said nothing. He'd long grown accustomed to being the subject of jokes. After all, how many times had people laughed when he told them about his plans for electric cars, or how he was going to revolutionize space travel? But he wasn't here for approval. Elon wasn't trying to win anyone over. He had a point to prove to himself more than anyone else. He wasn't a part of the mainstream crowd, and he never would be. And that was okay. As the evening drew closer and the talent show began, Elon found himself backstage, pacing nervously. He had always been good with tech and gadgets, but this was different. This was a real crowd, with real expectations, and a real chance to either prove everyone wrong or fall flat on his face. But that feeling, that spark of excitement mixed with a bit of fear, felt oddly familiar to him. It was the same feeling he had gotten when he first decided to launch a startup that no one thought would succeed. It was the feeling of standing on the precipice of something huge, something that could change the world. But tonight wasn't about changing the world, it was about showing them who he really was. Elon Musk wasn't just the quiet guy who stayed in the lab all day. He wasn't just the awkward guy who had strange ideas. He had something real to offer, something that no one expected. The stage lights dimmed, and one by one, the performers made their way onto the stage. The first group of dancers strutted across the floor to the beat of an upbeat pop song, drawing cheers from the audience. Then, there was a singer who captivated the crowd with a soulful rendition of a popular ballad. The audience was loving it, and the energy in the room was palpable. Elon could feel the pressure building. Finally, it was his turn. He stood up, adjusting his glasses and clearing his throat. He had no costume, no flashy act. Just him. Stepping into the spotlight, the audience fell silent, unsure of what was about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elon began, his voice calm but steady. "I'm Elon Musk. And, tonight, I'm going to show you a little something I've been working on. I hope you find it interesting." The crowd exchanged confused looks. Interesting? Was that it? Elon moved toward the center of the stage, where a large screen had been set up. He didn't need a microphone, didn't need any props. He just needed them to watch. "I'm not here to entertain you," he continued. "I'm not going to dance or sing. What I am going to do, though, is show you something that could change the way we live. Something that might seem impossible right now, but maybe one day, it won't." The students in the audience were still unsure whether they should be amused or concerned. This was not what they expected. He wasn't going to perform magic tricks or do something ridiculous like juggle. No, Elon was going to do something completely different. Something that would probably make him the laughingstock of the entire talent show. But as he clicked a button on his phone, the large screen behind him flickered to life, displaying a simple, yet bold graphic. It was a concept for an electric car. But not just any electric car. This was a car that could drive itself, that could power entire neighborhoods with the right battery technology. This was a concept that had never been seen before. The audience fell silent. The graphic was stunning. Elon wasn't just talking about an idea that could change the world, he was showing them the future. A future that was no longer some distant dream. It was happening right now, and it was happening here. The silence was broken by one student, who shouted out, "You're kidding, right? No one is ever going to build that." Elon smiled quietly, the fire of determination burning in his eyes. "We'll see." He continued, talking about the technology behind the concept, about how electric cars could not only reduce pollution but also fundamentally change the way we used energy. He spoke about a world where space travel was possible for ordinary people, where sustainable energy wasn't just a trend, but a necessity. The more he spoke, the more the crowd began to quiet, realizing they weren't just hearing a crazy idea, they were hearing a vision. When he finished, the room was still. There were no cheers, no applause. Only stunned silence. For a moment, Elon thought maybe he had failed. Maybe it was too much for them to grasp. But then, as he turned to leave, he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. A slow clap. It was followed by another. And another. Soon, the entire auditorium was clapping. Elon turned around, stunned. It wasn't just applause. It was admiration. They weren't laughing at him anymore. They were respecting him. As the applause continued, Elon felt a sense of quiet pride. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong, or showing off. This was about showing them that the future was already here, it just hadn't fully arrived yet. And in that moment, Elon Musk, the quiet tech nerd who had been mocked and ridiculed, stood at the center of the stage, knowing that for the first time in a long while, he had truly left them speechless. This is just the start of Elon's journey. The stage is set for him to push even further into the world of the unknown, proving that sometimes, the best way to win is not to perform for the crowd, but to show them what they never saw coming. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Elon Musk wasn't always the quiet, eccentric genius people thought of today. Long before he was the founder of multiple game-changing companies, before he sent rockets into space and dreamed of colonizing Mars, Elon was just another kid trying to figure out his place in the world. He was born in Pretoria, South Africa, a country far from Silicon Valley but not too distant from the stars. Elon's childhood was not what you might expect from a future billionaire. In fact, it was a lot more complicated than that. His parents, May and Errol Musk, had a complicated relationship. While May, his mother, was a dietitian and a model, Errol was a successful engineer, but their tumultuous marriage wasn't easy for young Elon to witness. Growing up, Elon was often a loner. He spent hours reading books, especially about science and technology. He was fascinated by anything that could give him insight into the universe, from space exploration to the power of computers. But while other kids were out playing sports or hanging out with friends, Elon would often be lost in his thoughts, thinking of new inventions or ways to change the world. His parents didn't quite understand him, and neither did the other kids at school. Elon was bullied, relentlessly. He was an outsider, and it wasn't hard to see why. He didn't fit in with the crowd, he wasn't interested in the same things the other kids were, and, to make matters worse, he was often physically awkward. One particularly brutal incident at school shaped him deeply. Elon had been walking through the schoolyard when a group of bullies shoved him, knocking him to the ground. As he tried to get up, they continued to kick him, taunting him all the while. He didn't fight back. He couldn't fight back. It was then, in that moment of humiliation, that he learned an important lesson. Sometimes the best way to deal with adversity wasn't to fight back but to endure. That experience haunted him for years, but it also sparked something in him. That pain, that isolation, became a driving force in his life. It would be easy to say that this event defined Elon, but in truth, it was just one of many things that pushed him to become the person he was destined to be. Despite the bullying and his difficult relationship with his father, Elon was always driven by a sense of curiosity and a desire to understand the world on a deeper level. When he was 10 years old, he taught himself computer programming. He wasn't just playing video games, he was learning how to create them. By the time he was 12, Elon sold his first software, a game he'd created called Blaster. It was a simple space-themed game, but the fact that he had made it on his own showed that he had something few others did: determination. Yet, there was more to Elon's drive than just a fascination with technology. There was an underlying sense that his life had a greater purpose. And that purpose wasn't just to create gadgets or make money. It was to push the boundaries of what was possible. To challenge the status quo and show the world that there was always another way to solve problems. Elon's mother, May, played a significant role in shaping who he became. May was a tough, independent woman who always encouraged her son to follow his own path, no matter how unconventional. "You have to follow your own heart and intuition," she would tell him. "The world doesn't need another copy of everyone else." Her words stayed with Elon throughout his life, especially when he left South Africa at the age of 17 to move to Canada. Elon made the difficult decision to leave his father behind, a man who had a strained relationship with him, and start fresh in North America. He enrolled at Queen's University in Ontario, eventually transferring to the University of Pennsylvania, where he pursued degrees in physics and economics. But even though he was at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, Elon still didn't fit in. He didn't care about the social scenes or the typical college experiences. Instead, he buried himself in books, in technology, and in the idea that he could one day create something that would change the world. In fact, during his time at university, Elon started dreaming up ventures that would one day turn him into one of the most well-known entrepreneurs of his generation. After graduation, Elon's passion for technology took him to Silicon Valley. He knew this was where he needed to be, surrounded by people who were pushing the boundaries of innovation. But when he first arrived, he wasn't immediately embraced by the tech community. He was an outsider. He didn't have the typical pedigree, no prestigious Silicon Valley internship, no family connections in the industry. What he had was a fire that burned within him, a determination that no one could extinguish. And so, Elon started small. He launched Zip2, his first major tech company, in 1995. It was a software platform designed to provide business directories and maps for newspapers. While it wasn't the kind of revolutionary tech that would change the world, it was a start. And it was a significant one. He worked tirelessly, barely sleeping, just to make sure Zip2 could succeed. Eventually, it was sold to Compaq for nearly $300 million, a windfall that would lay the groundwork for Elon's future ventures. But even after that early success, Elon still faced skepticism. He wasn't some polished, well-educated businessman. He was a guy who had come from nothing, a guy who had been mocked and ridiculed for his ideas. His ideas were often too big, too audacious for most people to understand. But for Elon, that was the point. He didn't want to build something that was just another business. He wanted to build something that would change the world, that would solve problems no one else even thought to solve. But what was the next step? What could Elon Musk possibly do after Zip2? He could have easily taken his money and invested in something safe, something that wouldn't put him at risk. But that wasn't Elon's way. Instead, he did something that most people considered insane. He started X.com, an online payment company that would eventually become PayPal. Once again, Elon was bucking the trends, following his instincts even though everyone told him it was a bad idea. And that was just the beginning. From there, Elon would go on to launch companies like Tesla, SpaceX, and Solar City, each one more ambitious than the last. Each one driven by a sense of purpose that few could understand at the time. But even as he continued to face ridicule and rejection, Elon never stopped. He always knew there was something greater out there for him to achieve. And it was that very belief, that no matter how ridiculous, how impossible it seemed, that would eventually lead him to prove the world wrong. And on that talent show stage, he was just beginning to show them what he was truly capable of. Elon Musk's life had always been a series of calculated risks, daring ventures, and facing skepticism at every turn. But standing in front of that crowd at the talent show, he realized that there was something uniquely personal about the experience. This wasn't just about his latest tech concept or unveiling a game-changing idea. It was about the perception of him as a person. In that moment, Elon wasn't just pitching his vision, he was also confronting years of ridicule, isolation, and doubt. The questions that had plagued him for decades suddenly felt louder. Am I crazy for dreaming this big? Am I enough? As the applause faded and the echoes of astonished murmurs drifted through the auditorium, Elon couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. People had clapped. Sure. They had been impressed. But there was something cold about it. Something distant. And as the applause began to die down, the whispers started. They had been subtle at first, but now they were inescapable. Did you see that? Elon Musk just thinks he's changing the world by showing us a graphic on a screen. This isn't a talent show, it's a TED Talk. Jessica, sitting with her friends in the audience, let out a low snicker. I told you he was going to pull some weird stunt, she muttered under her breath. He's so full of himself. What does he think? That he's going to revolutionize everything by flashing a PowerPoint presentation? Her friend, Mark, who had been skeptical from the start, raised an eyebrow. Honestly, I don't get it. He talks like he's already on the cover of Forbes or something. Like he's already figured it all out. As they chatted amongst themselves, Elon remained backstage, staring into the mirror. He had done something unexpected, but the response was more distant than he had hoped. His heart pounded in his chest, not from excitement but from the nagging feeling that perhaps the audience wasn't ready for what he had to offer. He wasn't used to feeling like an outsider. Had he missed the mark? Elon's phone buzzed in his pocket, and it snapped him back to reality. It was a message from his closest friend, one of the few people he trusted, David, a fellow student who had always been there to encourage him, especially during moments like this. Hey man, you killed it tonight. Ignore the critics. They don't get it yet. You're on the right track. Just keep pushing forward. For a moment, Elon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was reassuring, hearing David's message. But the doubts still gnawed at him. What if he wasn't enough? What if no one believed in his vision? What if they saw him as just a crazy, eccentric dreamer? As the talent show continued, Elon's thoughts raced. What would happen if people only saw him as the strange kid with the weird ideas? After all, it wasn't the first time that he had been misunderstood. When he launched Zip2 and then PayPal, people had dismissed him. They'd laughed at his ideas, called them impractical and far-fetched. Now, just a few minutes after his appearance on stage, he felt the weight of those old doubts creeping back in. But then, something happened that would change the course of his journey forever. A familiar face approached him in the backstage area. It was Marcus, the head of the Student Entrepreneurship Club, a guy who had always been too busy to give Elon the time of day. Elon had seen him at numerous networking events, and though Marcus was often dismissive of his ideas, this time was different. Hey, Elon, Marcus said, his tone surprisingly earnest. I know we've had our differences, but what you did tonight, it was impressive. I can't say I understand everything you said, but I get that you're aiming for something bigger than all of us. I want to talk more about your vision. Let's grab coffee sometime. For a moment, Elon just stared at him. Marcus had never shown even a hint of interest in his ideas before. Was this genuine? Was this the start of something that could change the dynamic for him on campus? Maybe Marcus had just been swept up in the moment. After all, it was easy to admire someone who had big dreams when those dreams were shared in such an unexpected, unique way. Sure, Marcus, Elon replied, still taken aback. Coffee sounds good. As Marcus walked off, Elon was left standing there, torn between two thoughts. Was this the validation he had been waiting for? Or was it just another empty gesture, a polite way to dismiss him without confrontation? The self-doubt continued to circle in his mind like a persistent storm. The next day, word about Elon's performance spread like wildfire across campus. Some of the reactions were expected, almost cliched: whispers in the hallway, students making jokes at his expense, calling him the guy who thinks he's the next Steve Jobs. But other responses were more surprising. A few professors, those who understood the complexities of technology and innovation, began to approach him in the hallways, intrigued by what he had shown them. Interesting concept, one of them said after class. You might be onto something, Musk. But you'll need a lot more than a PowerPoint presentation to convince the real movers and shakers. Elon had always respected his professors. They were the ones who had challenged him to think critically, to push the boundaries of conventional thinking. But now, their words were more than just praise, they were a challenge. The kind of challenge Elon loved. If you think I need more than a PowerPoint presentation, then you haven't seen anything yet. By the end of the week, the buzz surrounding Elon's talent show performance had grown to something more tangible. On campus, people were talking. There was skepticism, yes, but there was also curiosity. It wasn't quite admiration yet, but it was closer. And that, for Elon, was more than enough. But the real challenge was coming. As he stood on the brink of something big, a new conflict began to arise, one that was far more personal. The friends he had once relied on were now questioning his decisions. People he had trusted, like Jessica and Mark, were beginning to distance themselves, treating his aspirations as little more than a joke. But as one door closed, another began to open. Elon was no longer just an outsider with big ideas. He was someone people were watching closely, waiting for him to either succeed or fail. And as the pressure built, Elon realized that the true conflict wasn't just about proving the world wrong. It was about proving to himself that he could take these ideas, these dreams, and make them a reality, no matter who mocked him, no matter who didn't believe. The world was starting to change, and Elon was just getting started. Elon had always been a man of vision, and deep down, he knew that every great leap forward required a period of isolation, struggle, and doubt. As the weeks passed after the talent show, he began to understand something deeper. The buzz around his presentation, the mixed reactions, the subtle mockery, it was all a part of the journey. And while the outside world was still skeptical, a small but growing group of students had begun to take him more seriously. However, the real test wasn't the reactions he got at the talent show or the ripple effects of his words. It was about whether he could take these first steps and turn them into something real, something world-changing. And to do that, Elon would have to face a much bigger challenge than just getting attention on campus. The kind of success he dreamed of required more than just an idea, it needed resources, collaborators, and the one thing he lacked, a platform. So, Elon decided to take his boldest step yet. He would push beyond his comfort zone and try to turn his campus vision into a tangible project, something larger than what any of his peers had done before. It was time to go out and find the people who believed in him, the ones who could help him make his dream a reality. The first thing he did was reach out to his network. He texted David, his longtime friend, who had been with him through thick and thin. David, he wrote, I think I have something. It's not just another app or website. It's something that could change everything. Are you in? David's response was swift, always. Tell me when and where. It was a small step, but to Elon, it meant everything. Having someone who believed in him, someone who had never doubted his ideas, was a rare comfort. But Elon knew this wasn't enough. He needed more. Over the next few weeks, he met with several professors, business leaders, and potential investors. To most, his vision was too big to fathom. Mars colonization? Why not focus on something more grounded, something more practical? One professor had asked during their lunch meeting. But Elon wasn't discouraged. In fact, that question became fuel for his fire. Why not Mars? Why not the moon, or even further? This wasn't about being grounded, this was about taking humanity to the stars. He believed that if humanity didn't aim high enough, it would be content with stagnation. He couldn't be content with stagnation. His mind raced with possibilities, and every conversation was a reminder that no one was ready for what he had in store. One evening, as he was walking back to his dorm room, Elon met a fellow student, an ambitious engineering major named Sarah, who had been in one of his classes. Sarah had always struck him as someone who wasn't afraid to ask tough questions, someone who was genuinely interested in understanding what made things tick. She wasn't like most of the others, content with the status quo. When Elon mentioned his ideas about space travel and renewable energy, her eyes lit up, and without missing a beat, she said, "That's what I've been thinking about. Let's make it happen." Elon was taken aback, not by her enthusiasm, but by the fact that she had the same drive and belief he did. Could it be? Could he finally be finding the team to make his dream a reality? "Let's do it," Elon said, without hesitation. But this isn't going to be easy. The two of them began to sketch out the beginning of what would eventually evolve into something far bigger than either of them could imagine. They didn't know it yet, but this would be the start of something groundbreaking. The days that followed were a blur. Sarah's skills in engineering and Elon's technological genius blended together to create the initial framework for a startup. They started writing up business plans, refining the details of their vision, and reaching out to potential investors, all while trying to juggle their university commitments. The university library became their unofficial headquarters, the place where dreams and reality collided. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. As their plans began to take shape, the struggles became more apparent. They had limited resources, little funding, and not enough support to build what they envisioned. Yet, Elon was determined not to let anything get in his way. He had been dismissed his whole life. He had been laughed at, bullied, and underestimated. But this time, he wasn't going to back down. One evening, as the clock ticked late into the night, Elon found himself alone in the library, staring at his computer screen. The pages of code he was working on didn't seem to make sense anymore, and the weight of everything he was trying to accomplish felt heavier than ever. He rubbed his eyes, tired from the endless hours of work. Was he pushing too hard? Was this madness? But as he sat there, the weight of doubt threatened to take over. Something inside him clicked. He had already come this far, and there was no turning back now. If he wanted to be remembered, if he wanted to prove that his dreams weren't just pipe dreams, he had to go all in. He had to give everything. Just then, his phone buzzed again. It was David. "Got some investors lined up for next week. You ready?" Elon smiled to himself. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for had arrived. He was no longer just a student with an idea. He was becoming the architect of his future, a creator in the truest sense of the word. The meeting with the investors would be a defining moment in his journey. Elon knew that the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, rejection, failure, criticism, but he was prepared. This wasn't just about a product or a company, this was about changing the world. And there was no turning back. The days leading up to the meeting with potential investors felt like an emotional roller coaster. Elon Musk, despite the outward confidence he projected, was deeply aware of the weight that rested on this moment. He had spent years nurturing his ideas, dreaming big, and enduring ridicule. Now, everything depended on whether he could convince these investors to take him seriously. Failure was not an option. As the meeting day drew near, Elon and Sarah refined their pitch. They rehearsed tirelessly, every detail meticulously planned, every argument crafted to perfection. Elon knew that this wasn't just about the business, it was about selling them on his vision of the future, a future where humanity was no longer confined to Earth but was thriving on other planets, making use of sustainable energy, and advancing science in ways people had only dreamed of. It was a vision so big, so audacious, that he was certain some of the investors would laugh him out of the room. But he had no choice. This was his dream, and for once, he wasn't willing to settle for anything less than the opportunity to make it come true. The day of the meeting arrived, and Elon found himself standing in a sleek conference room, surrounded by people who, on the surface, seemed to have everything he didn't: money, influence, resources. The investors looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Their eyes flicked between Elon and Sarah as they prepared to pitch their startup. Elon could feel the nervous energy building within him, but he pushed it down. This was his moment. He started speaking, his voice calm but filled with conviction. He shared his vision for sustainable energy and space exploration, how humanity needed to expand beyond Earth, and how they could get there with the right technological innovations. The presentation was compelling, the idea was bold, but as he spoke, he noticed the shift in the room. At first, the investors seemed interested, but as Elon began to delve into specifics, some of the skeptical glances returned. It wasn't until he mentioned his plans for Mars, a full-scale colonization mission, that one of the investors, a seasoned venture capitalist named Greg, raised a hand and interrupted. "Let's pause for a second," Greg said, his voice sharp. "Mars? Really? We're talking about a planet millions of miles away, with no infrastructure, no resources, and no feasible way to get there in the near future. How exactly do you plan on getting all of this off the ground?" Elon's stomach dropped. It was the question he had been waiting for, but not in this way. He had imagined an open-minded audience, not one so quick to dismiss his grandest dream. The tension in the room was palpable. Sarah shifted uncomfortably beside him, but Elon held his ground. He knew this was the critical moment, the emotional climax of his journey. "I understand your skepticism," Elon replied, his voice steady. "But let's look at history. People once laughed at the idea of flying, of going to the moon, of connecting the world with the internet. Every major leap in human history started with someone who had the vision to see beyond what was possible. I'm asking you to invest in that vision." Elon's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was silent. But the silence wasn't comforting, it was heavy. The investors exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Elon could feel the unease settling in his chest, as if the dream he had worked so hard for was slipping through his fingers. Then, another investor spoke up. This time, it was Linda, a female entrepreneur known for her sharp instincts in the tech world. "Okay, Elon," she said, her tone neutral but thoughtful. "I get what you're saying. The future is uncertain. But why space? Why not focus on something more immediate, something more tangible, like energy storage or electric vehicles? What makes you think you can succeed where others have failed?" Elon felt the sting of the question, but he pushed through. He had been preparing for this. He knew that no one truly understood the bigger picture yet, but he was about to show them why they should. "Because, Linda," Elon began, his voice quieter now, but with an intensity that drew everyone's attention, "without space, without a backup for humanity, we risk everything. We are one catastrophic event away from losing everything we've built here on Earth. I want to create a future where humanity is no longer confined to one fragile planet. If we're going to make it, we need to think beyond our current limitations. I know it's a huge challenge, but I'm ready to take it on. And I'm asking you to join me." There it was. The weight of the idea. The core of his passion. Elon knew that his vision might seem crazy, but it was also undeniable. It was a vision that dared to dream on a scale that few dared to imagine. And if he was to get these investors on board, they needed to see not just the challenges, but the potential of his audacious dream. The room fell into another silence. Elon's heart raced as he stood there, waiting for a response. He had laid everything on the line, his reputation, his dreams, his future. He wasn't just selling a company, he was selling a future. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Greg spoke up, his tone less certain than before. "You're right," he said slowly. "It's bold. It's risky. But I can see the potential. And I respect your drive. You've got something here." Elon couldn't believe it. Had he done it? Linda, who had been quiet for the last few minutes, nodded in agreement. "I'll take a risk on this. Let's see where you can take it." The other investors chimed in, one by one, each agreeing to be part of the journey. It wasn't a huge sum, but it was enough. Enough to get started, enough to prove that Elon's vision wasn't just a fantasy. It was a future that was now within reach. As the meeting ended, Elon walked out of that conference room with Sarah, both of them still trying to process what had just happened. They had secured the funding to take their dream to the next level. It was a victory, but it was also just the beginning. Elon stood at the threshold of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. The hard part was just starting. He knew that the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, setbacks, and challenges. But for the first time, he felt that he had found the support he needed. And that, in itself, was the greatest triumph. But there was one more thing on Elon's mind. As he looked back at the room full of investors, his heart still beating fast from the intensity of the meeting, he couldn't shake the thought. Was this really the breakthrough? Or was it just the first step on a much longer and more difficult journey? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days following the investor meeting felt like a blur of activity. Elon and Sarah immediately set to work, putting together a plan that would transform their newly funded startup from an idea into something tangible. It was the beginning of what would later be known as SpaceX, but at the time, it was still a dream, a vision still far from reality. Despite the elation of securing the initial funding, Elon knew this was just the first hurdle. The excitement of the moment was starting to wear off, and the real work began. He had 1,000 ideas racing in his mind, but the task of turning those ideas into actual products, services, and technology was daunting. As he sat at his desk, poring over spreadsheets and blueprints with Sarah, it became clear, the journey would be harder than he had imagined. But the obstacles were no longer something to fear. They were challenges to be overcome. The hardest part wasn't the technical details or even the competition in the marketplace, it was the constant self-doubt that crept in at the edges of his thoughts. He had worked tirelessly to get to this point, and yet there were moments when he questioned whether he was truly capable of pulling off such a monumental task. Were his ambitions too lofty? Were they unrealistic? One evening, as Elon sat alone in his office, staring at the blueprint for the first spacecraft, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. Had he come all this way only to fail? Was he chasing a dream too big for anyone to truly grasp? He thought back to the talent show, the ridicule, the laughter. They had mocked him then, but now, that mockery felt like the very fuel that had propelled him forward. Elon had learned something vital, that the opinions of others, the doubts, and the criticisms were part of the process. They were an inevitable part of trying to change the world. Why not, he had said at the talent show. Why not change the world? Why not dream bigger than anyone thought possible? And now, even in the face of insurmountable challenges, that question remained at the core of everything he did. It was that mentality that kept him moving forward. He got up from his desk and walked to the window of his office. The city lights below twinkled like distant stars. For a moment, he let the quiet of the night settle over him. But the quiet wasn't comforting. It was like the calm before a storm. Elon knew that real change, real innovation, was never easy. It was about fighting against the tide, about pushing through when others doubted you. And Elon was ready for that fight. But there was something else that had started to weigh heavily on his mind, his relationships. The single-mindedness that had brought him to this point, the laser focus on his vision, had come at a cost. He had always been more comfortable around ideas than people. His deep commitment to his work had alienated friends, strained family ties, and put his romantic relationships on hold. He had become a person entirely consumed by his ambition. He thought about his mother, who had always supported him, and his brothers, who had remained close, though they didn't always understand his obsession with space and technology. But he realized that while he had been chasing a dream, he had neglected the importance of those who cared about him the most. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother, a simple text, "Thinking of you, hope you're doing well." Elon smiled, reading the message. He hadn't been in touch with her in weeks. Was this the price of greatness? He had always told himself that his work would speak for itself, that his ambition would be enough to justify any sacrifices. But in this quiet moment, as he looked out over the city, he wondered if he was sacrificing too much. He dialed his mother's number. "Mom," he said when she answered, his voice softer than usual. "I just wanted to say I've been thinking about you. I've been so wrapped up in this project, I haven't really called lately." His mother's voice was warm and understanding. "I know, Elon. I'm proud of you, you know that, right?" He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Sometimes, I feel like I'm losing touch with everything around me." "You're doing something amazing, Elon," she replied gently. "But don't forget about the people who love you. We're here, no matter what." As he hung up the phone, Elon felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had been so focused on his mission that he had forgotten what truly mattered, the people who had always supported him. It was a realization that hit him hard. His family wasn't just a backdrop to his journey. They were the foundation upon which everything else was built. The next day, Elon made a promise to himself. He would continue to chase his vision, but he wouldn't forget the people who had always been there. There was no point in changing the world if he couldn't also nurture the relationships that mattered most. He knew that balancing his dreams and personal life would be a challenge, but it was a challenge he was willing to take on. Weeks turned into months, and as SpaceX started to take shape, Elon felt a new sense of purpose. The startup began to build momentum, securing more funding, attracting talent, and finally beginning the early stages of developing their first spacecraft. The road was far from smooth, but Elon no longer felt the same sense of loneliness and self-doubt that had plagued him in the beginning. He had a team now, and more importantly, he had a new understanding of what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. But that wasn't the only realization that had come to him. He had learned something about the power of persistence. It wasn't just about vision. It was about the willingness to face adversity, to embrace failure as part of the process, and to keep going even when the odds were stacked against you. As Elon sat in his office one evening, looking at the blueprint for the Falcon 1, the first rocket that would carry his dream into space, he smiled. This was it. This was what it had all been leading up to. The breakthrough. The moment where everything he had worked for began to align. The journey had only just begun, but Elon Musk knew one thing for sure: he was ready. The momentum around SpaceX began to build. With the initial investment secured and a team of talented engineers and technicians assembled, the vision Elon Musk had for the company was becoming a reality. However, turning his dream into a fully operational space exploration company came with its own set of challenges that only those who dared to venture into uncharted territory truly understood. Elon had learned the hard way that money alone wasn't enough. It wasn't just about securing the funding, it was about getting the right people on board, about creating a culture of innovation and perseverance. Despite the talented minds that had gathered around him, the pressure to succeed weighed heavily. The first project for SpaceX was ambitious: a reusable rocket. Conventional rockets were expensive, and their one-time use meant that launching a spacecraft was an enormous financial burden. Elon's vision was to create a vehicle that could be reused again and again, cutting the cost of space travel by orders of magnitude. But no one had ever tried it before. The idea seemed audacious, even reckless, but that was exactly the kind of risk Elon had come to embrace. As the team got to work on the Falcon 1, the first rocket SpaceX ever built, Elon was hands-on, spending hours with engineers and technicians, analyzing designs, solving problems, and offering feedback. It wasn't just about overseeing the project, Elon immersed himself in the details, learning from every mistake, every failure. Space exploration was a field where even the smallest misstep could lead to catastrophe, and failure was not something Elon took lightly. Failure is an option, Elon would often say in meetings, but giving up is not. The first test flight of the Falcon 1 was set for March of 2006, and despite all the preparations, Elon couldn't escape the anxiety that gnawed at him. He'd come so far, he'd secured funding, gathered a team, and built a rocket from the ground up. But this launch would define everything. If it failed, the world would see it as just another failed attempt by a man who dreamed too big. The night before the launch, Elon stayed at the SpaceX facility, surrounded by his engineers. Sarah, still by his side, noticed the exhaustion and stress in his eyes. She knew how much this meant to him. She also knew that Elon didn't like to show fear, but she could sense it, the fear of failure, the fear that this whole endeavor might crumble. "You okay?" Sarah asked, standing next to him as he looked over the Falcon 1 on the launch pad. Elon didn't answer immediately. He was deep in thought, his gaze fixed on the rocket as if willing it to launch successfully. Finally, he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "I've spent my whole life chasing this. What if this is the end? What if we fail?" Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder, offering the kind of quiet support she always did. "Elon, you've been through worse. Failure is part of the journey. It's how you learn, how you grow. This is just the beginning." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Sarah had been with him through the ups and downs of the startup, and she knew how hard it was for Elon to accept that sometimes, failure was necessary. But she also knew that failure wouldn't define him, it was his reaction to it that would shape his legacy. The next morning, Elon stood on the launch pad with the rest of his team, watching the final countdown begin. As the clock ticked down, a sense of urgency settled over everyone. The tension was palpable, each second stretching into eternity. Everyone on the team knew the stakes, and despite the hours of preparation, it was impossible to predict what would happen. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The rocket engines roared to life, and the Falcon 1 surged upwards into the sky. The cheers from the SpaceX team were deafening. For a moment, it seemed like everything was going to plan. But just seconds into the flight, something went wrong. The rocket veered off course. Elon's heart sank as he watched in horror. The Falcon 1 exploded in a ball of fire, its mission a catastrophic failure. The silence that followed was crushing. No one spoke. Elon felt his stomach drop as the weight of the failure set in. All that effort, all that time, all those hopes, it had amounted to nothing. The people who had once mocked him at the talent show now had something more to mock. He had poured everything into this, and it felt like he had just watched his dreams go up in flames. The press coverage was brutal. Headlines from all over the world heralded SpaceX's failure. Elon Musk's rocket explodes, a billionaire's failed dream. The words stung, each one a reminder of the monumental risk he had taken. People were calling him reckless. Others claimed that no one could ever succeed at something as complex as space travel. And yet, in the midst of all the criticism, Elon held his ground. This was the reality of innovation, failure was inevitable, but it couldn't be the end of the story. He wouldn't let it be. The days following the Falcon 1's failure were a blur. Elon met with his engineers and technical team, analyzing what went wrong, examining every possible factor that led to the disaster. Instead of retreating, Elon doubled down on his commitment. SpaceX would not be defined by one failure. They would learn from it, rebuild, and try again. Elon wasn't about to give up on his vision. Not now. Not ever. In one of his meetings with his team, Elon addressed the group with the same resolve that had gotten him to this point. "Everyone, I know the world is watching, and they're waiting for us to fail. But we're not going to let them define us. We're going to build, test, and build again. We will succeed. The next few months were a whirlwind. With the lessons learned from the Falcon 1 failure, the SpaceX team worked tirelessly to perfect their designs and ensure that the next test flight would succeed. Elon's faith in his team never wavered. He knew that the road to success was paved with failures, but he was more determined than ever to see his vision realized. And in the end, the road to the first successful launch of the Falcon 1 wasn't just about technology, it was about perseverance. It was about learning to accept failure, not as a defeat, but as a stepping stone. And it was about the unwavering belief that no matter how impossible the journey might seem, the destination was always worth fighting for. After the devastating failure of Falcon 1's first launch, the mood at SpaceX was heavy. The dream Elon Musk had so carefully crafted, one that seemed so tangible in the early stages, now seemed farther away than ever. It was hard to describe the emotional toll the failure had taken, not just on Elon, but on the entire team. Despite the intense pressure, Elon knew there was no time to wallow in defeat. SpaceX's survival depended on the next steps. His next move would either make or break the company. There was no question in his mind that they would attempt again. In fact, he already started planning for the next launch. The aftermath of the explosion was like a cruel reminder of how difficult space exploration truly was. The media, who had once celebrated his audacious goals, now saw him as a symbol of failure. The critiques came fast and furious. Headlines like, "Musk's space dream crashes and burns," or "Another billionaire's failure," were splashed across newspapers, websites, and even news broadcasts. For many, it seemed like another example of someone who reached for the stars and fell flat on their face. But Elon wasn't one to bow to public opinion. The ridicule only added fuel to the fire, driving him even harder to succeed. He couldn't afford to lose. Not now. Not after everything. SpaceX's engineers had already started dissecting the issues that led to the failure, and Elon was involved in every step of the process. Late-night meetings, endless calculations, and countless hours of testing, they worked relentlessly to pinpoint the malfunction that caused the explosion. It was hard to pinpoint just one thing, but they knew that if they were going to succeed, they would have to learn from every single detail, no matter how small. The team identified several key problems, most notably the lack of structural integrity in some of the rocket's components. The parts weren't able to withstand the stress of the launch. For Elon, this wasn't just a failure of the rocket, it was a failure of his leadership to ensure every aspect of the mission was perfected. However, it was the team's dedication and tireless effort that ultimately pushed the company forward. Elon had gathered a group of individuals who weren't ready to give up. They knew that success wasn't guaranteed, but they also knew that greatness only came to those who persisted in the face of adversity. Failure is an option, but quitting is not, Elon had told them in one of his most memorable speeches to the team. His eyes burned with intensity as he spoke. "We can't afford to let this define us. We're going to fix this. And when we launch again, it will work." The engineers worked around the clock, making modifications to the Falcon 1's design. Elon's commitment never wavered. Even though the pressure was mounting from all sides, including investors, employees, and the public, he was resolute. "I didn't get into this to make money. I didn't get into this to be famous. I got into this because I believe in the potential of humanity," Elon would often remind his team. With the new designs in place and the team's spirit fully restored, the second launch was scheduled. This time, Elon had a greater sense of optimism. The lessons from the first failure were clear, and the team had worked diligently to address every issue. Elon knew the second launch would be a defining moment. Not just for SpaceX, but for him as well. The morning of the second launch arrived, and the energy around the SpaceX facility was palpable. This wasn't just another rocket launch, it was their shot at redemption. The team had worked tirelessly to make sure everything was perfect. But despite all the preparation, there was still a lingering uncertainty. Elon's mind raced with thoughts of failure, but he quickly shut them out. There was no room for doubt. Not anymore. As he stood on the launch pad that morning, watching the Falcon 1 ready itself for takeoff, Elon felt something different. The first failure had shaken him to his core, but it had also forged something in him, a clarity of purpose. He had come to realize that failure was not just an obstacle, but a crucial part of the journey. Without it, there was no growth. Without it, there was no progress. 3, 2, 1. The countdown echoed in his ears. The roar of the engines was deafening as the Falcon 1 shot into the sky. This time, there was no deviation. No wobble. No explosion. The rocket climbed higher and higher, leaving the Earth's atmosphere behind. Elon stood motionless, eyes fixed on the rocket as it made its ascent. When the rocket reached space, the room erupted in cheers. The team celebrated, hugging, shouting, and clapping one another on the back. It was a moment of collective triumph. The impossible had been achieved. But Elon wasn't celebrating. Not yet. It wasn't until much later that evening, when he sat in his office, staring at the video footage of the launch, that it truly hit him. They had done it. SpaceX had just launched the first privately funded, liquid-fueled rocket to reach orbit. It was a groundbreaking achievement, one that would forever change the course of space exploration. And it had been done in the face of overwhelming odds. Elon leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of reflection. The journey had been far from easy, and it wasn't over yet. But this success had proven something to him, and to the world. SpaceX was no longer just a pipe dream. It was a real company with a real future. The world was watching, and the possibilities were endless. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, new rockets to build, new missions to undertake, and new problems to solve. But Elon was no longer afraid. He had learned the value of resilience, of perseverance in the face of failure. And as he sat there in the quiet of his office, a smile tugged at his lips. The success of Falcon 1 was just the beginning. With the successful launch of the Falcon 1, SpaceX had crossed a crucial threshold. What had once seemed like an impossible dream was now a legitimate contender in the rapidly evolving space race. Elon Musk, the unlikely rocket pioneer, was no longer seen as a crazy billionaire. Instead, the world was beginning to recognize him as a visionary who had brought something unique to the space industry, a focus on cost-cutting, reusable technology that could one day make space travel more affordable and accessible to everyone. But success came with its own set of challenges. The media, while now acknowledging the accomplishment, quickly shifted their attention to what SpaceX could do next. The skepticism that had initially followed Elon was still there, but it was now tinged with curiosity. Could SpaceX repeat their success? Could they keep the momentum going, or was this just a lucky one-off? For Elon, this was just the beginning. He knew that to make real progress, SpaceX needed to prove its capabilities repeatedly. The next goal was even more ambitious, securing a contract with NASA to send payloads into orbit. This wasn't just about proving SpaceX's worth, it was about cementing the company's place as a key player in the space exploration field. Elon's focus shifted from the internal workings of SpaceX to the bigger picture. With the Falcon 1 success, he set his sights on the Falcon 9, a larger, more powerful rocket designed to carry payloads to space for commercial and governmental purposes. The Falcon 9 was also designed to be reusable, a hallmark of Elon's vision for reducing the cost of space travel and ensuring that space exploration wasn't just for the elite but for humanity as a whole. "We have to think bigger," Elon told his team during one of their strategy meetings. "We can't just stop at one success. We need to take the next step. We're aiming for the stars, literally." This was when the stakes truly began to rise. Elon was still dealing with the aftermath of the Falcon 1's explosion, and while SpaceX had learned from their mistakes, he couldn't afford another failure. The Falcon 9 was a giant leap forward. It was meant to launch payloads into orbit, potentially carrying astronauts to the International Space Station, ISS, but this meant that SpaceX was now in direct competition with some of the world's biggest aerospace companies. NASA, which had previously relied on giants like Boeing and Lockheed Martin for its launches, was now looking at SpaceX with interest. Despite the setbacks, despite the doubters, they saw potential in Elon's vision. But trust wasn't built overnight. NASA's approval would be difficult to win, and it wasn't something that could be taken for granted. The pressure mounted again. SpaceX had to prove that they could build a reliable rocket, launch it into orbit, and, most importantly, do so on time and on budget. Failure wasn't an option, not when the whole world was watching. The team at SpaceX, led by Elon, poured everything into the Falcon 9 project. The rocket was designed with reusable components, meaning the first stage of the rocket could return to Earth, land vertically, and be reused for future missions, something no other space company had even come close to achieving. Elon knew this would be the game changer. But the challenges were immense. The Falcon 9 was far more complicated than the Falcon 1, and every aspect of the rocket had to be engineered with precision. The development process was grueling, and there were moments when Elon wasn't sure if they were going to make it. Sometimes, it seemed like the weight of the task was too much. There were days when the team felt like they were drowning in technical hurdles. It was in these moments that Elon's leadership and resilience became crucial. He refused to let his team give up. And he refused to let doubt creep into his own mind. He was all too familiar with failure, and he knew that the only way forward was to keep pushing, to keep solving the problems that arose no matter how daunting they seemed. Sarah, who had always been by his side, could see the stress beginning to take its toll on Elon. He was working longer hours, pushing himself to the brink of exhaustion, but she knew that if there was anyone who could handle this kind of pressure, it was him. "Elon, you're burning out," she said one evening, standing at the doorway to his office. Elon looked up, his eyes weary, but a flicker of determination still burned in them. "I can't afford to burn out, Sarah. I can't afford to fail." "You don't have to do it alone," she replied softly. "You've got a team that believes in you. Don't forget that." Elon paused, taking a deep breath. It wasn't the first time Sarah had reminded him of this, and yet it always had a grounding effect on him. He nodded slowly. "I know. I'll be okay." The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. The Falcon 9 was becoming more than just a rocket. It was a symbol of everything SpaceX stood for: innovation, risk-taking, and the relentless pursuit of progress. Elon's dream was closer than ever, but it still required more sacrifices. Finally, the day arrived when the Falcon 9 was ready for its first launch. The team, now accustomed to working under pressure, gathered at the launch site, eyes fixed on the rocket as it stood tall on the pad. The air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just another test flight, it was their shot at proving to the world that SpaceX was more than just a lucky, one-time success. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. Elon stood in the control room, watching the monitors, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. The engineers around him were quiet, too, all eyes glued to the screens. No one was speaking, but the energy in the room was palpable. 3, 2, 1. The rocket engines ignited with a roar, and the Falcon 9 blasted off into the sky, climbing higher and higher. This time, there was no failure. No explosion. The rocket soared toward its destination, and a wave of relief washed over the team. Elon allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The Falcon 9 had succeeded. It was a flawless flight. As the rocket completed its mission and returned to Earth, the world watched. This was a game-changer for SpaceX, and for the future of space travel. Not only had the Falcon 9 succeeded, but the rocket's first stage returned safely to the ground, intact, and ready for reuse. For Elon Musk, this moment marked the culmination of years of work, setbacks, and sacrifices. But it was also just another stepping stone on his journey towards something even greater. "Success is not the end of the road," Elon said later, addressing his team. It's the beginning of the next challenge. The space race was on. And SpaceX had just entered the fight. With the successful launch of Falcon 9 and the world watching SpaceX's every move, Elon Musk's ambitions were higher than ever. The company had finally solidified its place in the space industry, but for Elon, this success was just one milestone in an even greater journey, the colonization of Mars. Elon had been vocal about his dream to make humanity a multiplanetary species for years. The thought of Earth's future being at the mercy of a single planet was a constant source of concern for him. He envisioned a world where people could live and thrive on Mars, in case something catastrophic happened to Earth. This wasn't a flight of fancy, it was his mission, his purpose. But now that SpaceX had taken the first major step by perfecting the Falcon 9 and demonstrating the power of reusable rockets, Elon knew the next challenge would require all his focus and energy. SpaceX needed to develop a spacecraft capable of taking humans to Mars, something that had never been done before. He also needed the technology to land on the surface and create sustainable habitats for people once they arrived. He was determined to do what no one had even dreamed of in the modern era: send humans to Mars and give them the tools they needed to survive. "I know it sounds impossible," Elon said in a press conference one afternoon. "But we have to try. We are now at a point where SpaceX can be a key player in humanity's next great frontier. Mars is the next step." The announcement of SpaceX's Mars ambition took the world by storm. Some called him mad, others called him a visionary. But no one could deny the power of his determination. Elon had always been known for his ability to think big, and this time, he was asking the world to think even bigger. To many, Mars was an abstract concept, something that existed in science fiction, not in reality. But Elon's resolve was clear: he wasn't building rockets to fly to the moon or carry satellites into orbit. He was building them to change the future of humanity forever. For SpaceX, the goal was clear: develop a spacecraft capable of interplanetary travel, with a focus on sustainability and affordability. The world was already familiar with the reusable rocket concept, but now it was time for SpaceX to push the envelope even further. Elon introduced the idea of the Starship, a massive, fully reusable spacecraft designed to carry both crew and cargo to destinations beyond Earth. Unlike any other spacecraft ever built, the Starship was designed with Mars in mind from the very beginning. Elon envisioned a ship that would not only carry people to Mars but also provide the means to terraform and establish a self-sustaining colony. To achieve this, SpaceX's engineers and scientists worked tirelessly to develop new technologies, from better life support systems to advanced propulsion engines. The Starship would be powered by Raptor engines, which were a key component of the company's long-term vision. These engines were designed to be highly efficient, capable of producing enough thrust to send a spacecraft to Mars and beyond. But even as SpaceX pushed forward with their ambitious plans, they knew there were obstacles they couldn't ignore. Mars, while tantalizing, was still an inhospitable planet. The journey itself would take months, perhaps years, and living conditions on Mars would be far from ideal. The atmosphere was too thin, and the temperature was far too cold to sustain life without the aid of technology. Not to mention, the radiation exposure on the surface would be lethal without proper shielding. Yet, Elon's belief in humanity's ability to solve problems was unwavering. He saw the challenges not as roadblocks, but as puzzles to be solved. Every hurdle was an opportunity to innovate, and every failure a lesson to be learned. Throughout the next several months, SpaceX began testing prototypes of the Starship, moving forward with an intensity few had ever witnessed in the aerospace industry. The test flights were anything but smooth, but with each failure, they learned more about the complexities of interplanetary travel. Rockets exploded, prototypes malfunctioned, and more than once, it seemed like SpaceX's dream might be slipping out of reach. But each failure only brought the company closer to its goal. During one particularly intense testing phase, the first high-altitude flight test of the Starship prototype ended in a spectacular explosion just as the rocket tried to land back on Earth. It was another moment of failure. The internet was filled with critiques, mocking Elon and his team's vision as reckless and far-fetched. Headlines like "Elon Musk's Mars dreams go up in smoke" were plastered across the news. Elon, however, remained unfazed. "That's what innovation looks like," he said during a live broadcast following the explosion. "Failure is a part of the process. We will learn from this, and we will do better next time." His response was typical of his character, a blend of optimism, realism, and an unwavering belief in the mission. His approach had always been the same: never let failure define you, but let it guide you. Over time, SpaceX learned from every setback. The company continued refining the Starship's design and technology. Each failure led to improvements, and slowly, the public began to understand that this wasn't a race. They were building the future of humanity, and it would take time. Elon had set an audacious goal, but he wasn't alone in his vision. Investors and engineers, who had once been skeptical of his plans, were now fully invested in the idea of reaching Mars. His relentless optimism had become contagious. He had surrounded himself with a team that believed in the mission and were willing to put everything on the line to make it happen. After several years of testing, development, and setbacks, SpaceX was finally ready to send an uncrewed Starship mission to Mars. This mission would be a key step in proving that the Starship was capable of making the journey to the Red Planet. The excitement was palpable as the day of the launch approached. The mission was groundbreaking in every sense. It was more than just another test flight. It was a demonstration to the world that Elon Musk's dream of making humanity a multiplanetary species was closer to reality than ever before. As Elon stood on the launch pad, looking up at the massive Starship, he couldn't help but reflect on how far SpaceX had come. From the failure of Falcon 1 to the successful launch of the Falcon 9, and now, to this, SpaceX was on the verge of making history. It was a culmination of years of work, failures, and persistence. But in Elon's mind, this was just the beginning. "Success is not the goal," Elon said, watching the countdown. "It's the journey. The road to Mars is just the beginning of a new chapter for humanity." The day had finally come. It was an event that would go down in history. The first uncrewed Starship mission to Mars was about to launch. The spacecraft, which stood like a colossal beacon of human ambition on the launch pad, represented everything SpaceX had worked for, a culmination of years of setbacks, triumphs, and an unwavering belief that humanity's future lay beyond the confines of Earth. Elon Musk stood at the edge of the control room, his eyes fixed on the massive screens, filled with data from the spacecraft as it prepared for its historic flight. Despite all the breakthroughs and milestones SpaceX had already achieved, this moment felt different. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just a test. This was the beginning of the journey toward Mars, the first step in proving that interplanetary travel was not only possible but imminent. The whole world was watching. The tension was palpable as cameras and microphones filled the space, capturing every second of the event. Elon had always known that the road to Mars wouldn't be easy, but standing here now, at the very edge of this monumental achievement, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. From the days when SpaceX was a small startup with nothing more than a big idea, to this very moment, when they were on the verge of proving that space travel could be affordable, sustainable, and accessible to all of humanity. "I always said that we could do this," Elon said to Sarah, who had quietly joined him in the control room. "But it's surreal to think it's actually happening." Sarah smiled, her eyes bright with pride. "It's been a wild ride. And it's just beginning." Elon nodded, but deep down, he knew this was only one part of the story. SpaceX's Mars mission was only a step on a much longer path, a journey that would take decades, perhaps even centuries. Mars wasn't the endgame. It was the first chapter of a new era for humanity. And while they were sending an uncrewed ship, the long-term goal was clear: a human settlement on Mars, a self-sustaining colony where people could live, work, and thrive on a new planet. 10, 9, 8, the countdown began. The voice over the intercom was steady, but even through the calm tones, there was an underlying excitement in the air. "Elon," one of the engineers called out from across the room, "we're approaching launch readiness." Everything's green across the board. Thanks, Elon replied, his voice calm, but his heart racing. Let's do this. As the countdown continued, Elon's mind wandered to the early days of SpaceX, the days when he was mocked for thinking the impossible was possible. When people laughed at his vision of reusable rockets and human settlements on Mars. He thought about those first rough days with Falcon 1 and the countless hours spent in SpaceX's headquarters, tweaking designs, making endless adjustments, and confronting failure after failure. Back then, Mars had seemed like a distant dream. A dream that no one believed was worth pursuing. But now, as the countdown reached the final seconds, Elon's dream was on the cusp of becoming a reality. 3, 2, 1. The engines roared to life. The sheer power of the Starship's engines was a spectacle. The rocket launched into the sky, its flames cutting through the air with an almost otherworldly intensity. The ground trembled beneath them as the spacecraft ascended, piercing the atmosphere and heading toward its final destination, Mars. In the control room, there was a moment of stunned silence. For a brief instant, it seemed like the world had paused, everyone watching the trajectory of the rocket, their hearts collectively beating as one. Then, slowly, the cheers began to ripple through the room. "We did it," one of the engineers whispered, eyes wide with disbelief. Elon's face softened with a mix of relief and pride. It was the first major step in a long journey, but it was also a moment that encapsulated everything SpaceX had fought for. The world would know that this wasn't just a company trying to reach for the stars. This was a company that was pushing the boundaries of human potential and rewriting the rules of space exploration. Hours later, the world erupted in celebration. News outlets from around the globe carried the story: SpaceX successfully launched the first uncrewed mission to Mars. The internet was flooded with images of the rocket's ascent, videos of the launch, and awestruck reactions from people watching at home. Social media was abuzz with hashtags like #ToMars and #SpaceXOnMars, as millions celebrated the success of the mission. But for Elon, the celebration was short-lived. This was a major milestone, but it wasn't the destination. The real work was still ahead. The Starship would need to safely reach Mars, and the critical data collected during the journey would pave the way for future missions. More test flights would follow, more technologies would need to be developed, and humanity's colonization of Mars was still a long way off. The next day, Elon stood in front of a crowd of SpaceX engineers, some of whom had been with him from the very beginning. As he addressed the team, his voice was filled with the same determination that had always fueled his drive. "We've made history," he began, his words carrying weight. "But this is just one small step. We've shown the world that Mars is possible. But now we need to take it further. We will land there. We will colonize Mars. And we will make humanity a multiplanetary species. We have a long road ahead, but we've already proven that we can do the impossible." The team erupted in applause. But there was no doubt in anyone's mind that the road ahead would be anything but easy. There would be more tests, more failures, and plenty of setbacks. But if anything, the success of the Starship mission proved one thing to everyone in that room: SpaceX wasn't just trying to reach for the stars. They were going to bring humanity with them. Elon Musk had always believed that success wasn't about the destination, it was about the journey. The road to Mars would be long, but it was a journey worth taking. And with each step, he knew the future of humanity was unfolding before their eyes. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?